Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and this video is going to discuss some laws in business that are relevant and the connection between, what would you say, business law and business ethics, right? So, this class doesn't cover a lot of business law. And the reason is because business ethics is a different issue, right? As we've already seen, I think early in the course, you know, just because something is law doesn't mean it's ethical, and just because something is not a law doesn't mean that it's unethical, right? We can embrace or reject laws on ethical grounds, right? Certain laws that existed 50 years ago we thought were unethical, and so we changed them, right? And some laws that are on the books now we also find unethical, and so we promote change for them, right? Um, so and also sometimes there's not a law for something that we think there should be, right? So in general, law is kind of can be thought of as reflecting our kind of ethical sensibility, right? But it's not an exact correlation, right? And so when you're talking about business ethics, you're not always talking about what is legal, right? Sometimes businesses do things that are legal that we really find that are unethical, right? And this whole practice of kind of finding some kind of loophole or whatnot. But nonetheless, looking at business law can raise a number of issues about what we really think is ethical and can give us a sense of how to track where we're at with things, right? So, the example I like to give to kind of highlight this feature is to look at, I give an example of the Factory Act, I think it's 1833 or something like this. Now, this is in the Industrial Revolution, and these are some of the first kind of laws to be placed in a capitalist system, right? And at this time, there was a lot of factory work, and working conditions were particularly brutal, and it was pretty much kind of like the wild, wild west, for lack of a better term, in the sense that there were no regulations, right? And so some of the first laws, like the Factory Act, was basically an anti-child labor law. And it was a series of regulations in that act. And they stipulated that I think it was something like children under 9 can't work more than like a 9-hour day. Yeah, children 9 to 13 to work no more than 9 hours a day. Children under the age of 9 can't work at all. And notice that the 9 hours a day does not stipulate anything about weekends, right? So it's 9 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it says children 13 to 18 years to work no more than 12 hours a day, right? And children are not to work at night, this kind of stuff. Um, this this likely sounds to us as kind of crazy, right? That you have to say something to businesses about this kind of stuff. We would think that a 10-year-old should not be working 9-hour shifts 7 days a week. But nonetheless, they had to stipulate that because there were children that were working 12, 14, 16-hour days, right? And the way in which this was received by businesses was not well. They really felt like these laws were constraining them. They would never be profitable if they have to, submit to these extreme regulations. They're putting this government stranglehold on them, and the reason why I bring this up is because it gives us some perspective. Right, we're very far away from that picture. And it gives us a sense of kind of what we really think is ethical, and the fact that this kind of child labor we find to be particularly appalling, right? But that same dynamic is something that you'll see in legislation today, right? So the two main pieces of legislation um, are the SOX Act and Dodd-Frank. So SOX Act is in 2002, and this is federal oversight of corporate accounting practices. It is in response to what was it, Enron scandal, right? And it created a number of stipulations. It kind of has like three main parts to it, right? An accounting oversight board, and which is supposed to kind of, you know, look over companies' books and this that. Um, Auditor and analysis independence. I put this little thing mechanic problem next to it. So, what does this mean? Well, the auditor, the person who audits your business, and the person who functions as your analyst to tell you what you should do, right, have to be different. They have to be different entities. And I put the mechanic problem because basically, if you have the same person who's kind of looking through your books and the same person who's fixing your books, right? Then this runs the risk of that person being very dishonest with you because you kind of have a blind spot there. You don't really know what they're saying, and they could create problems that you don't have, and they could say that you don't have problems that you do have, right? And so I say it's the mechanic problem because it's like when you go to bring your car in, and if you're not a mechanic, right, they say, oh, you need $1,200 worth of work. You don't know how to verify that or disconfirm it, right? So you're kind of stuck with their analysis, but they're also the people who are doing the work, and so they have a motivation to inflate and misconstrue what kind of problems you might have with your car, right? And so they wanted to get rid of that because it would get rid of some corruption in these kind of analysis and consulting firms, right? There's also whistleblower protection, right? So we're familiar with this idea of whistleblower, which is anyone who, calls out a company based on unethical or illegal practices, right? Usually someone internal, and they're kind of blowing the whistle, right, and calling attention to something. These whistleblower protections were pretty minimal. I think they said that if someone is a whistleblower, then they can't be fired. But of course, the company could just fire them and say it was for some other reason, right? We've seen this quite a bit, right? So that's SOX Act, and then Dodd-Frank, and these are very brief. But Dodd-Frank is more recent, 2010. This is kind of in response to the economic collapse, housing bubble of 2008, and this was more focused on consumer protections, right? A lot of people were given loans that not necessarily on false pretenses, but they were overextending themselves with giving loans and providing no qualifications for these loans and so on and so forth. And so this has another oversight committee, which is the Financial Stability Oversight Committee. It created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right, which is something that's going strong today. And here it emphasized the whistleblower protections by adding a whistleblower bounty program. And what that means is that if I'm working at a company and I know that they're embezzling $3 million at that company and I'm a whistleblower, I'm entitled to a percentage of that if it goes to court and the federal government wins that case, right? I think it was something like 10, 15% or something like this, right? So, there are pros and cons to this. I think one thing to notice about these pieces of legislation is that there's the issue of implementing them and whether or not they're successful and whether or not they play out the way in a way that kind of meets the spirit of the law, right? In the whistleblower, and then also, some of these are in fact controversial. So the whistleblower bounty in general, we tend to think, you shouldn't get paid for being an honest person. However, if you think about the reality of what it means to be a whistleblower, oftentimes a person is ostracized from that industry in general, right? People don't trust them, and they kind of end up being in the news or known within that industry. And so, having a little bit of money as a cushion might give someone the courage to actually speak out who otherwise wouldn't, because there's kind of no upside, especially if you blow the whistle on a company and the company goes under because of that, right? You basically working your way out of a job, and There are pros and cons, right? And it's questionable whether or not this is kind of the right avenue. And in general, there's two things I want to mention about these laws. One is if you go back to Adam Smith and Marx and this idea of the free market, right? That the free market will take care of itself. These kinds of legislation, and there are many of them before this, right? Um, Show that these are all instances where the government has had step in and you know corral the free market, provide stipulations, right? And the governments all over the world do this constantly, right? They are kind of watching the market and providing incentives. They're providing constraints all the time, right? And so the idea that the free market is kind of just working on its own is really just not empirically true, right? It just doesn't line up with the facts, and hasn't for a long, long time. So these constraints come from outside of the market, right? The government is a separate entity from the marketplace and in a capitalist system, right? And the government is providing this external constraint. Um, Another reason to mention this is that these are pieces of legislation that you would call pro-competitive pieces of legislation. What does that mean? They promote competition, right? Another example of this would be like anti-monopoly type legislation, right? When the government decides to break up a company because it takes too much market share. Um, Now, from the perspective of a business, they will see this as unfair. If you have a large company, you've grown it that way, and the government wants to break you up, you would say that's not fair. I worked hard. Why are they kind of putting this roadblock in front of me? However, pro-competitive legislation is not supposed to be kind of fair for particular businesses. It's supposed to be fair for business in general, right? And so it's supposed to promote competition, and that means it's kind of leveling the playing field for everyone. And this protects the consumers and so on and so forth. So, um, so that's kind of the dynamic to recognize kind of government versus business, right? And how that plays out and why some people think it's very, very necessary, right? Um, so anyways, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we will talk soon.